Good evening. Welcome. I really appreciate so many folks coming out on such a nice night. It seems like every time I do these, I'm competing with really nice weather. And so I know, especially this time of year, when we get a nice day, I really like to see so many people interested and dedicated to learning more about timeout. So I'll try to keep this interesting, but I'll also try and keep it brief. I want to have this driven as much as possible by the interests and questions that you have. So with that in mind, let's see. These are the three things I'm going to talk about. Kind of your goals for what you want to get out of this presentation, discipline in general and how that can work in terms of kind of sculpting and directing your child's behavior, and then talk more specifically about timeout. And I'm going to do as much as possible. We've gotten a lot of feedback with the kind of online aspects of this, and so I'm going to direct as much as I can up to that camera. And it might sound really repetitive and redundant when I repeat your questions, but I want to make sure that everybody who's utilizing this presentation in every kind of way can keep up with everything that we're talking about. So with that in mind, what do you want to learn about tonight? Or what do you want to take away from this presentation? Okay, discipline in general. What else?
Yeah, how to discipline your child, yes.
Okay. Okay.
How to feel that I'm being effective without feeling defeated, like I really haven't, met the purpose.
Okay, feeling effective, general discipline.
Listening skills of my child.
Getting them to listen. Okay. Other things? Has anybody tried using timeout and it doesn't seem to work? Okay, tell me about those problems that you run into.
My daughter likes it.
Okay. Likes timeout. Okay.
See, mine's the same, but she's also ADHD. So, in between being her grandmother, but also raising her as my own daughter, it's kind of hard because I'm fighting with both.
Both.
Being mom and grandma.
Okay, so I'm hearing multiple roles. How do I manage multiple roles with my child? And also, what about complicating factors? If there's ADHD or other kinds of issues, okay? Other questions or other specifics?
Knowing exactly how long the child should be in timeout as he ages.
Okay, so some specifics as far as the timeout procedure itself.
So what if you do timeout and then they get out of timeout and they do it again?
Okay.
And again and again and again.
Getting out of timeout. Sounds like a familiar one. Yes?
Age-appropriate timeouts. So talk about ages a little bit, what might work better for one age than the other, or developmental stages.
Okay, age-appropriate development. Other specifics? Yes.
How do we even evaluate if timeout is the right discipline option for each child?
Evaluate if time out is appropriate. Okay. Any other specifics? Yes.
Help with knowing what the child should be sent to timeout for, because you don't want to send them for everything.
Okay, when to use timeout? When is it appropriate and when might you want to try something else? Okay. Yes.
How you should behave after the timeout is done. Should you try to, what do you do afterward? Do you try to consult them or explain, just what do you do afterward?
What to do when timeout is over. Excellent. Yes.
I want to know if I can use timeout outside of my house, like in church or a grocery store or somewhere like that.
These are great questions and make me feel very confident about this presentation because I have a lot of slides dedicated to some of the questions you're asking.
Well, what if they say they have to pee?
Ah.
Because he's done it several times. I'm like, we just went to the bathroom. Puddle. Drives me nuts.
Okay. Other ones? Yes.
What to do when he runs out laughing at you?
What to do when he runs out of timeout laughing. Okay. Yes.
Kind of tag on to what to do after. What do you do during?
Okay. Yes.
Timeout the older siblings, and the older siblings trying to put the younger sibling in timeout, and vice versa.
Older siblings try to discipline. Okay. This is a great, oh.
What if they won't stay in timeout? You've got to actually stand right by them, and is that the right thing to do, or?
Okay. These are all really, really great questions, and I want to make sure that we get to all of them, but I feel really confident that what I have for you all tonight is going to get at a whole lot of these questions. There may be some specifics, but if you don't feel like I've captured these adequately, and also the folks at home can tweet or chat or somehow internet their questions here, and we can address those as we go along. But this is a great list to start with. The other reason I really like to do this is so I heard a lot of laughter at some of these questions, and I suspect that's because it's familiar, that a lot of folks are dealing with exactly the same things at home. And one of the difficulties in parenting is a lot of the time you're doing it isolated in your own home. So you don't see, oh, all these other parents are struggling with their kids running out of timeout, or making up excuses to get out of timeout, or kind of struggling what to do at the end of timeout when I really want to give them a hug, but is it still part of the consequence? What do I do in those situations? And so these are a lot of common struggles. And so it's really important to know that there are other parents out there struggling with exactly the same thing. So before we get to the timeout intervention in and of itself, I wanted to talk just briefly about what to do to make any and all consequences more effective for kids. So you want the consequence to happen as immediately as possible. So as close in time and space to the occurrence of the problem behavior as you can possibly achieve. And so this gets at your question about when can I use timeout in the store, can I use timeout in church? Ideally, you want to do it in those places because you want to make sure that the consequence is happening as close as possible to the actual problem. And I'm sure you see this in your own kids, that if you delay it, kind of like, there's a problem before school or daycare, and you wait until you discipline after school or daycare, it's totally out of their head, and it makes the consequence much, much less effective. Now, there are times where it gets really complicated because, if you're driving in a car and you can't, really feel like you can't do a timeout at that point, you got to wait till you get home, something like that. Kids are really good at knowing when they have you over a barrel and when they can't get the consequences that they might typically get when they're at home, say if you're at church or at grandma's house or those kinds of places. So keeping this in mind, as much as possible, you want to get that consequence as close as possible to the actual problem behavior. The other thing you want to make sure is to be as consistent as possible. It can be really, really, really confusing for kids if I get a consequence for hitting my sister today, but it doesn't happen tomorrow. Or it happens, I get a timeout when mom's around, but I don't get a timeout when dad's around. And so you want to make sure that across caregivers, across settings, across times of day, this can get really, really complicated in the morning if you're trying to get out of the house for school or work or daycare. But what this teaches kids is if I don't get a timeout in this context, I can get away with a lot of things in this context. And that can give you the incentive to test when I can get away without getting a timeout. So if I can get away with it before school, maybe I can get away with it when we're at Walmart. Maybe I can get away with this when we're at grandma's house. And so you want to be sure to be as consistent as possible with timeout and any other kind of disciplinary approach that you're using. And then I can't stress enough how important this is, making sure that the consequence, any consequence that you use, is contingent. So they do the crime, they do the time. This means you want to be very, very careful not to give a lot of explanations, a lot of ultimatums, a lot of threats, a lot of if you do that again, you're going to go to timeout, or offering the consequence, do you want a timeout? That's not a consequence. And so what I learn that I hit my sister, I can get away with it at least once because I'm going to get a warning about it. And the other thing that you want to be careful to be contingent about this with is if you actually want the behavior to stop, they have to have a consequence every single time, because otherwise it's dependent on the caregiver to be around to apply that consequence. They don't decide on their own, I can't hit anybody right now because I'll go to timeout. Well, mom's not around, so I can get away with this. Or dad's not around, so I can get away with this. You want them to learn, I can't ever get away with this. I'm not ever just going to get an explanation or another chance or a choice about whether or not to go to timeout. I did something I wasn't supposed to, I get the consequence for doing that thing that I wasn't supposed to. Any questions so far? All this makes sense? Okay. So, time in is the single most important part of time out. You need to be the most fun, enjoyable, enthusiastic, delightful, amazing, exciting thing in your child's life. They've got to really, really, really enjoy their time with you, because if they don't, taking that away is not going to have any effect at all. So, especially when we're talking about kids in the 2 to 5 age range, you want to be fun, you want to be playful, you want to make sure that every single day that you're dedicating time to time in. So, and even if it's 5 minutes a day of undivided attention, you want to make sure that's going on, because if nothing else, it'll kind of whet their appetite for more and set up the contrast that when I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, mom, dad, grandma, aunt, uncle, whomever's taking care of me is all about me. And when I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do, that being withdrawn sets up a really sharp contrast. And that's really what makes time out effective, is the absence of any kind of sort of warm, fun parenting interaction. So, with the groundwork set, we can talk about what timeout needs to look like. A lot of parents and a lot of manuals and treatments and parenting resources talk about kind of guidelines and specifics, like where should you do it, when should you do it, how long should it last, all these kinds of things. We'll talk about some of that, but the single most important thing to keep in mind is that it has little to do with those specifics. That what you're trying to do is achieve a particular state of mind in your child, and that is that you are kind of closed for business. That you're, as much as possible, not going to be fun, engaging, and giving them any kind of attention whatsoever. And so when I work with parents on this, I talk about you're a statue. You may have to be a statue that chases them and puts them back into timeout, but there is no interaction coming from you at all. And if there has to be interaction, it's happening as minimally as possible. And what you want to achieve is them recognizing that they don't have you for that period of time, and that is the consequence. And so whether that lasts 30 seconds or 5 minutes, it doesn't make any difference. I mean, there's some variance in terms of development and age and sort of environmentally appropriate, and we'll talk about some of those variances, but this is your goal in terms of timeout. And this is also one of the things that undermines parent success more than anything else. That kids will go into timeout and find ways to engage their parents while they're in timeout. Whether I miss you, I love you, I hate you, running out of timeout, saying they have to go to the bathroom, going to the bathroom, all of these kinds of things. Trying to get you. And while they're doing this, it suggests to me that you're on the right track. You might not be there yet, but if you're getting all kinds of resistance and your child reaching out to you in these kinds of ways, that means that they miss you and they're trying to draw you in. And so we just got to talk about and figure out ways to make sure that there's no way that they're drawing you in. Okay? So as far as specific situations in which to use timeout, this varies by family and culture and arrangement of a household, all these kinds of things. But general rules that I talk to parents about who come see me in clinic, aggression, property destruction, so like intentionally breaking toys, any kind of dangerous behaviors, running out into the street, climbing on things, and sometimes also repeated noncompliance. So I told you once, I told you twice, now there's a consequence. And there can be space for other consequences on the way to timeout, but if you're getting repeated noncompliance over a particular situation, then that might be time for timeout. How to use, this is how you achieve the state of mind that you want to be absolutely as boring and disengaged as possible. It's not about being harsh or rigid or mean in timeout. This is absolutely blank, that there's yelling, screaming, crying, whatever's going on, they can do that and you're still not engaging with it. And this is also why you can be flexible with the time of this, because there's only so much yelling, screaming, crying, kicking, whining that a parent can stand. But you want to make sure that's driven by you and not by the child. I'm committed to doing timeout for this amount of time. This is the amount of time the timeout's going to last. So no reaction. I talk about either a statue or a robot when you're doing timeout, and this can be really hard. My wife and I have a 16-month-old, and we use a very, very brief timeout when she hits or when she's in her high chair throwing food. The timeout maybe lasts 5 seconds, and at that age, the difficulty's not laughing because her reactions are painfully cute. When kids get older, it's a totally different situation. That if you have a 5, 6, 7-year-old going to timeout, they're capable of some pretty defiant behaviors and some behaviors that can get you really agitated. You want to be careful. What you're doing doesn't bother me at all. It's a gentle breeze blowing through the house. I barely notice. And that's what's going to make it effective, is that they're not engaging you in any kind of way. So location, this is something that can be really, really flexible, and it depends on your house, your apartment, your townhouse, where you're at the time. So many, many places can work for this. I talk to families about using a corner, using a chair, using a step. It can be in the middle of the room, it can be in a hallway, it can be in a bathroom. Essentially what you're trying to achieve is as little stimulation as possible. And so any kind of ruckus that they cause in timeout is not going to draw the attention of brothers or sisters or anybody else in the house. And so you want as little stimulation as possible and as little engagement as possible. And we'll talk about how to roll out this procedure. You want to practice having it be the same place, at least in your house, while you're in kind of a more controlled environment. But the behaviors that happen when you're in timeout can be moved to any place that you go. So you can do it in the car, you can do it in the store, you can do it in church if you like. But the location is not as important as the kind of procedure or experience. And so basic guiding principle, you want everything about timeout to be really, really boring. And so finding a place in your house that's really, really boring. For some families, I recommend for kids that are running out all the time, using a small room in the house. It might be a spare bedroom, or it might be like a half bath, something like that. Especially for younger kids, I don't recommend putting them in and closing the door because you don't want them to get into things, but you can actually stand in the room with them. And that is the most powerful way to do timeout, because you're physically present in the room, you've got them contained, and you're not giving them any attention whatsoever. And so that experience is all the more kind of relevant or salient or kind of in their face, that mom or dad or grandma, who's ever given me this timeout, can be here and not give me anything at all. And so there's a lot of flexibility here, and a lot of kids need help with containment. And so to keep them from running around, that sometimes a room timeout is a good way to go. If ever you do that, you want to make sure it's a safe place. They can't climb up on things, they can't get the chemicals, all that kind of stuff. We talked a little bit about duration. There are a lot of schools that thought about this. It's easy for parents to remember a minute for every year of age, and so I talk about that. And it also takes into mind kind of developmental expectations, and so a 30-second timeout is going to be much less impactful for a 7-year-old as it is for a 1-year-old. So you want to kind of adjust it to the child's needs and kind of extend timeout potentially as kids get older. But it also depends on your child. Some kids can't sit for 5 minutes, especially if your child has been diagnosed with ADHD. A 5-minute timeout is really unreasonable. What you want to look for is the timeout achieves this state of mind, that you're totally disengaged from the child and the child has to sit with it. And so I don't recommend starting timeout until the child is quiet. And that doesn't mean totally silent, but yelling and screaming, timeout hasn't started. Running out of timeout resets the clock. Taking a bathroom break from timeout, you can negotiate that on the front end. If you have to go to the bathroom during timeout, okay, then you're right back into timeout from the amount of time that we've decided on the front end. I always recommend to set a timer because it can go either way. Some parents and caregivers can forget that their child's in timeout, and timeout goes 30 minutes longer than you would like it to. And on the other end, that it gets really, really difficult for a parent if the child is pushing back really hard, and so 5 seconds go by and it's all I can take. That's all that teaches the child, is that they're in control of the timeout, that they can come and go as they please, and that's absolutely something you want to avoid when you're using this kind of intervention. This last point is really, really important. I work with a lot of families who talk about how they put a child into timeout, an sort of undetermined amount of time passes, and the child comes out of timeout, and they decide, well, okay, timeout can be over. You've been in there long enough. But it's kind of a child-initiated end to timeout. It sends absolutely the wrong message, that the child is in control of timeout. Child comes out of timeout, you put them back in and reset the clock. Child asks if they can come out of timeout, you totally ignore it. And you use the statue or robot that we talked about before, that they're not in control. And they have to know that they can ask you any kind of question while they're in timeout, and they're not going to get an answer because they're in timeout. All that makes sense? Okay. And this is something that everyone can use even if you have a timeout that you use now, because we might be talking about changing it as far as what you do at home. So the way I talk to families about doing this, you sit down with your child if they're old enough and have a conversation about what timeout's going to look like. When you do this, 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 or this, you're going to get a timeout. This is the location where we're going to do timeout. This is how long you have to sit in timeout. Timeout starts when you're quiet. And then going through and practicing. So I'm going to practice putting mom in timeout. And then mom's going to practice putting dad in timeout. And then grandma's going to practice putting older brother in timeout. So you can see exactly how it's going to happen. And then we're doing it with your child. Okay, we're going to practice going to timeout. We're going to walk you over there. You're going to sit there. You don't have to sit there for the whole time, but timeout starts right now when you're quiet. We're going to sit here for 3 minutes, and then timeout's over. Come out of timeout, we go back to timeout. So you make sure on the front end it's crystal clear what this intervention is going to look like. You know, there's a lot of differences between kids. And so I do this as young as 3. I'm sure there are some really precocious 2-year-olds out there that could get it. And I'm sure there are kids out there who are 4 years old that might struggle with the language part, but you can act it out. That when you hit, you walk them to timeout and show them what that looks like. And all y'all know your kids much better than I possibly could standing up here, and so you'll know that I've got a kid that I can explain this to and they'll understand and go that way, or they won't get it at this age. That we'll have to practice a couple of times in sort of real life. And then once you've explained it in the kind of way that we've talked about, you go live with it. And once you decide to kind of go live with this intervention, you're no longer open for questions. So you go do timeout and you get all kinds of pushback like, oh, I didn't know that if I threw something I'd go to timeout, or I didn't know that if I, climbed to the top of the bookshelf I'd go to timeout. They're going to learn through this experience that, in fact, they will go to timeout when they throw something. Yes?
When they're in timeout, but they're asking these questions?
So the question was, does the timeout start over if they're in timeout and asking these questions? I would say depends on how they're asking it. If they're screaming at you, do I get out now, do I get out now, then it does start over. If they're sort of pleasantly wondering about it, oh, I wonder if my timeout's over now, then no. So essentially, if their behavior in timeout escalates to the point where it's a problem behavior in and of itself, then you can reset the clock. But if they're sitting quietly like, Mom, 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 can I come out now? Doesn't necessarily have to reset the clock. And you can talk about that ahead of time when you're sort of unveiling this timeout intervention to them. That, Johnny, your clock is going to reset if you're screaming at me. You can ask all the questions you want. You can ask 5 minutes of questions if you like, and it's not going to get you out any sooner. Okay? This takes a lot of practice. Like any other thing that your child's ever going to learn, whether it's math or riding a bike or whatever else they do, coloring within the lines. This is going to take a lot of practice for them, and you also have to expect it to take a lot of practice for you, because you're not going to get it right the first time, and you're not going to get it right every time. You come home from work, you're exhausted, flat tires, terrible rainstorm, it's an awful night. And so you might not use this intervention with the kind of compliance you'd like to. That's not to say you shouldn't use it, but you should also not beat yourself up if you're not doing it right every single time. That you're working hard to get this right, just like your child's working hard to keep their hands to themselves and follow directions and stay off the furniture. And so the more you practice, the better you're going to get at it and the more responsive your child is going to be. And I got to tell you, every single parent I've ever worked with has tried timeout at some point, and the majority of them give up on it because they feel like it's not working. Hopefully some of the things that we've talked about in here are different enough, and that's really what this is about, is small incremental changes. That this shouldn't be sort of a mind-blowing experience, but just little changes every single day that make it a whole lot better. But yeah, every parent I've ever worked with has talked about using timeout, and a whole lot of them talk about it not being effective. Don't give up. This can take a whole lot of work, and it's important to keep in mind that doing an intervention like this, the behavior might actually get worse before it gets better. Because a lot of times, using an intervention like this means that you're tightening up expectations, doing better with consistency and follow-through, and being much more kind of contingent in your behavior management. Like before, they might get a few warnings or a few threats or a few second or third or fourth chances. If you do that again, if you do that again, if you do that again, you're throwing all that out. And it happens once, and they're into timeout. That might be surprising, and it might be jarring. And you want to hold to that, because that's the expectation that you want them to get used to, that it's never appropriate to hit, that it's never appropriate to use, I didn't mention this before, it's never appropriate to use foul language, that might be another thing that they go to timeout for. But practice and practice and practice, and you might have a day where you use 5 or 6 of these, and you might have a day, I was working with a woman in Baltimore, and I really wish I could present her data, but it was wonderful. She did a really, really effective timeout, and it lasted 45 minutes. And she kept doing that really effective timeout, and there was this wonderful linear data that she presented. And by the time, it was maybe 4 weeks into it, timeout lasted 5 minutes. It was calm on both ends. Mom said, time to go to timeout. Daughter went to timeout. 5 minutes go by, daughter comes out of timeout, and you go on with the day. Yes?
Taunting, like a younger sibling, is a reason for a timeout. Like, kind of mean.
Sure. And, I have some general guidelines up here, but every family is different. There are some families that are really, really playful, and taunting is part of the family culture, and so not necessarily something that you want to discourage. If in your family you feel like that's inappropriate and not something that you want them doing, or they're doing it in ways that are hurtful to their younger sibling, absolutely that's appropriate for timeout. One of the other things I didn't mention about duration that gets at one of the earlier questions, what to do when timeout's over. So buzzer goes off, timer goes off, iPhone goes off. That does not let your child out of timeout. You let your child out of timeout. So buzzer goes off, they pop out of timeout, they're not getting out of timeout yet. That it's when you come and say, you were in timeout for hitting your brother, timeout's over. And that's the same way you put them in just as simple and straightforward a way. You threw a baseball through the window, now you have a timeout. In they go, in timeout for 5 minutes, timeout's over. You were in timeout for throwing a baseball through the window.
Kind of reminding them afterward why they're in timeout?
Yes, but nothing more than I just said.
Right.
You don't want to spend a lot of time with, it's dangerous to throw baseballs through the window because it puts glass all over the house. And then we have to clean it up, and then we have to get the window replaced. That is something that happens in a lot of families, that there's a whole lot of explanation around the problem behavior, and you want to stay away from that too. Simple in, simple out, and some families will also give the child the opportunity to answer the question. Now, when they come out of timeout, do you know why you went into timeout? I really discourage that, because that, again, puts the control back in the child's hand to, oh, I don't remember. I want to have a long conversation with you about why I went into timeout and get all this rich attention from you. So you were in timeout because you hit your sister, timeout's over. Child comes out of timeout, I would recommend waiting anywhere from 10 to 30 seconds, not to get too specific about it. Actually, the best thing to do is wait until the child engages in some kind of pro-social or positive behavior. So a child comes out of timeout and starts picking up toys. That's when you do the reunion. Oh, I'm so excited that you're cleaning up after yourself. Not, a lot of times kids will get kind of sad or pouting in timeout, and there's this impulse to run and give them a hug when it's done and have this kind of joyous reunion. That takes away the power of timeout. That it's much less effective if they know that, you know, mom's waiting with bated breath or dad's waiting with bated breath for timeout to be over too, so we can come back together.
Or I start crying after timeout's over.
Mm-hmm. So
they were fine during timeout, but once they get out, maybe there's, you know, a sense of guilt or something. They know they've done something wrong, and then they start crying. So you try to, you know, console them or.
Mm-hmm. How old?
2.
Okay. Sense of guilt might be a little bit complicated at 2 years old. But I hear what you're saying, that they feel that kind of rupture.
Maybe it's just like a, you know, a manipulation. Maybe they know that.
That tends to be what I suspect. And so if they really want to repair that, you give them a really simple command. Okay, timeout's over. They come out, they're kind of whiny and pouty. Touch your nose. Oh, you're so good at listening, here's a hug. Or, you know, there's this toy. It's a little bit distraction, but it's also showing them how they can reconnect with you. If you want to reconnect with me, push that chair in. And that's a sort of thought that you have in your head, that you don't give them that elaborate command. Oh, timeout's over, please pick up the mess you made. Yes?
Well, what if you go put them in timeout and they're screaming that they have no idea why they're going there?
That's how you introduce it. So you did X, Y, or Z, now you have a timeout. Mm-hmm. It's in very, very simple and boring terms. You did this, now you're in timeout, and that's it. Yes?
What if when they come out of timeout, you say, please go pick up your mess, and they refuse, and that's the reason they were put in timeout, then what do you do?
They'll be back into timeout. Mm-hmm. Which is also true if you put them into timeout and they make a mess while in timeout. Okay, timeout's over, now you need to pick up your mess. Refuse to do it, okay, now you have a timeout because you're not following directions. Now you have a timeout because you made this mess. one more quick thing I'm going to say is that you can hear how this is kind of it can be an ongoing process. Like you might have multiple timeouts back to back to back to back. What you want to make sure that they understand is they're not going to back you down. And that this sequence isn't going to end because they got you tired out or got you so annoyed that you didn't want to push it to its end. This is also why you want to be very careful in these times where in these moments where you don't have a lot of time or resources, not to put too many demands on your child. And so you can set yourself up for success if we got to get out the door for school. I'm not going to ask you to do a whole lot. I'm not going to give you a lot of time with your siblings because you tend to hit them during these times. And so I'm going to figure out ways to keep you separate. And so you don't have to, parents know when they're more likely to encounter these problem behaviors. And so you can set it up in such a way that you're not going to see it as much, so you don't have the risk of this long, drawn-out timeout procedure. Yes?
What if they're distracted enough that they didn't yell or anything, they still went on timeout, but within 2 seconds, they're looking at the wall, looking at the butterfly, you know what I mean? And obviously, it doesn't, at that point, it seems that it doesn't matter how long they stay because their mind is completely in something else, even though they're calm. So you still give them that length, or you just say, well, got out of the situation and obeyed, and okay, you're good?
I tend, in those situations, to drift to the okay, you're good. That if a child is able to sit in timeout for 5 minutes without having any engagement but their imagination, they're probably in a pretty good place. And we do want to make sure it's punishing in the sense that they don't like it. But that also kind of puts the burden on you to make time in really, really fun. Okay? Yes?
Question about the end process, especially if you're hitting. Mm-hmm. They're out of timeout. Is it then kind of part of the timeout process that they go and apologize to sibling or such, or do you have those things be totally separate?
I tend not to recommend that because it tends to be empty, first of all, and second, it gives them a lot of control. And in those situations, I have a lot of parents who get concerned about kind of the tone or genuineness of the apology, and there are just too many factors and variables in that. And at the ages where you're doing timeout, it's very unlikely that the child is going to have genuine feelings of shame and remorse and guilt about their transgression. And so an apology is absolutely something that you want to teach them in terms of manners. And if you want to do that, I wouldn't recommend doing it around the timeout. Like that is much more of kind of an instructional situation rather than a discipline situation. Like the apology shouldn't be part of the discipline sequence. I'm going to come to questions. I think I only have one more slide to give you, and I want to make sure I hit this point. That a lot of times parenting is really, 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 really exhausting and really hard and sometimes just debilitating. And so having a lot of stress around parenting is really, really normal and natural. That if you're doing it right, you should be pretty stressed out because you're going to get pushback and you're going to have a lot of behaviors that you want to correct, and you're working hard to raise a happy, healthy, successful person. And that is a really demanding experience. And so you want to make sure, even as we're talking about all these ways to manage your child's behavior, the single most important thing that you can do is to take care of yourself. Because if you're way too stressed out, if you're not getting enough sleep, if you're having daily arguments and fights with your partner or your boss, then you're not going to be an effective parent. And so making sure that you've got ways to manage your stress, your own stress, so it's not playing out in the stress that your child is causing, is going to make you a much more effective parent. And second, even more important than the parent-child relationship is keeping in mind the relationship you have with a parenting partner, that that needs to be kind of coordinated and nourishing and all of those kinds of things. Because if you don't have someone to rely on, this gets a whole lot more complicated. And this, it's not to say that single parents can't do it. Single parents absolutely can and can do it really, really, really effectively. And it's really hard not to be able to divide that stress in half and not have that kind of coordinated effort. And so if you have a parenting partner, make sure that you have ways to rely on them and coordinate with them and spend time with them away from the kids. And so I think I've got some really wonderful YouTube videos to watch, but I think this presentation's online. So if you want to watch the YouTube videos, I'll let you do that with your time and answer some of the questions that we have. Let's see. I think I talked a little bit about having to pee, running out of timeout laughing. That's just kind of a boring escort right back to timeout. What to do during timeout. Ignore in any and every kind of way you can. If you need to stand next to your child to do that, that's absolutely fine. I have parents who have iPods. That's a great time to catch up on podcasts when you're sitting and monitoring timeout, or anything else that can pull your attention away. Older sibling trying to discipline, no. You definitely don't want them doing that. And in fact, if it escalates itself to become it's a problem in and of itself, then that might be a timeoutable offense for that older sibling. But you're the parent, and you have that role, you have that authority. It's not their job to be giving timeouts to their siblings. What to do when timeout is over, we talked a little bit about that. Timeout outside of the house, this state of mind can be achieved anywhere. And so if you have to do a timeout at church, you want to find a quiet place that's not full of people. And if you're really well prepared, you can do it ahead of time. That we get to church 20 or 30 minutes early and have a conversation about if these behaviors happen when we're in church, this is where timeout's going to be. When we're going grocery shopping, if you're knocking everything you see off the shelf, this is where we're going to do timeout in Baker's or Walmart or Hy-Vee or wherever you go. That it can happen in those places. And if it can't happen in those places, we're going to leave the store, do our timeout in the car, and come right back to the store. And it can also happen in the car. You can turn off any and all attention. I've talked to parents about like pulling the car over and getting out of the car and standing outside of the car for a timeout. And so if that works into your agenda for the evening, you can pull over and do a timeout. I mean, of course, monitoring the child the whole time and parking in a safe place, but you can do that.
So
yes.
if they're in Target and kicking and screaming, it's best to not try to do a timeout in there, right? You would want to probably take it outside of the store.
It really depends. If you're the kind of person and you have the kind of child that could manage a timeout in a Target, then you can do that. Mm-hmm.
Just knowing that other people are there.
I think the parents of Robbie need to go to childcare for a diaper situation.
It also depends on the age of a child. And so a 2 or 3 year old, a timeout in Target is probably manageable. But if we're talking about a 5 or 6 year old, I would definitely recommend going to the car. And every time I've talked to parents about this, store employees tend to be really understanding. That this is my cart, these are my things, I don't want to fill it again. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Yes?
Just risky. I presume you mean by knocking things off shelf, you're talking about intentionally doing so. And not
Yes.
Like, oh, okay.
Knocking things off the shelf accidentally, I wouldn't recommend a timeout. But if you see like grabbing and throwing
When
things.
they're little, and that's kind of what I thought. I forgot.
Oh, yeah. Good question, though.
Does timeout work for screeching? You know, children that want to just screech at the top of their lungs in the house.
The question was, does timeout work for screeching? It can, absolutely.
So they screech in timeout
Mm-hmm.
until they're done,
Yes.
and then the timeout starts.
Yes, absolutely right. It might be a very, very long timeout if that's a well-practiced behavior, that they've done a whole lot of screeching, but yes.
How do I deal with the situation if dad's at work and I'm by myself with 2 kids and one of them's acting out and then the other one wants the other one to
does whatever the other one does because he looks up to the older sibling, so then he starts doing it, and I'm juggling between two kids in timeout, and neither one wants to stay in timeout.
Okay, this is a really great question. How to do timeout when you're flying solo and you've got multiple kids to manage. This is part of what I was talking about in terms of practicing a timeout procedure. And so setting it up ahead of time with the kids. When timeout happens, SpongeBob goes on. Or timeout happens, Dora goes on. That they know that there's going to be something really, really fun and interesting to do other than the timeout. And so you can engage them in that while you're dealing with the timeout. And if you have to do 2 timeouts, you may have to do 2 timeouts. And however you can partition the space to make that happen. And it may be a situation where you can't do it as immediately as possible. That the younger one might have to go to timeout first, and then you do kind of a timeout with the second one after. I'll come back to you. Yes?
Mine's kind of like on the lines of the screeching. What if the child is in timeout and they're screeching so much that, you know, you've got him in the timeout and it gets to the point where you have the police come to your door? Mm-hmm. You know, what kind of timeout would that consist of after you've explained the situation to the police officer?
So I talked about this today, I think, that I like to think of a carpenter and contrast that carpenter with myself. That if I were to walk into a carpenter's workroom and somebody told me to make a chair, I'd say, I have no idea what to do. I don't know what wood to use, how to cut it, how to use any of the tools in there, right? And so I got to fumble around and figure it out. Carpenter walks in, they know exactly what tool to use, and they make it happen right away really efficiently. If a child learns that they can use a particular response in timeout to make that timeout less effective, they're developing the same kind of expertise a carpenter would have and will go to that particular tool every single time that they're confronted with this intervention. And so, if screaming at the top of my lungs to get the neighbors to call the police works to get me out of timeout, I know that that's the most effective tool for me to use to get out of timeout.
Another timeout because they've had the police come to the door, or would you just let it go?
I would give them the timeout for whatever behavior you gave them the timeout for, because they can't control whether or not the police come. That their screeching in timeout means the timeout hasn't started yet, but they're, you know, the neighbors doing whatever the neighbors do, the police come to the door, that I would probably treat just like going to the bathroom in timeout. Like, I got to go answer the door because the police are here. Let the police know what's going on, and then we resume timeout. Because you want to be careful about that, because if the high-pitched screaming and shrieking works, you're going to see more of it. Yes?
And ignoring a child when they do something that they're not supposed to do, is that effective? I have a 16-month-old, and he's acting older than he is. Mm-hmm. When I ignore him on something that he doesn't want to do, it works, but I wonder if I continue doing that.
Ignoring is a really, really powerful and potent intervention, and what underlies timeout. I mean, timeout is a really powerful way to kind of planfully ignore your child. And so, yes, I think for certain things, ignoring is definitely very, very effective. At 16 months, I think it's even more effective, maybe, than older, because it sounds like you have a very responsive child who notices when you're ignoring and when you're not. And you're setting up a really powerful contrast between I'm paying very close attention to you when you're doing what you're supposed to do, and I don't know, when you're banging the pots and pans or whatever they're doing to get your attention, they're not drawing you in. You don't want to do this in dangerous situations. So if they're, you know, hovering over an outlet with a fork, that's not a good that's not a good time to ignore. But a decent time for a timeout, because they're engaging in that dangerous behavior. Yes?
We were a little bit late, so I apologize for any repetition, but child that wants to go to the bathroom every time they're put in timeout, mm-hmm. What's your advice there?
Different ways to handle that. It's either hold it until you're done And if you're sick of getting your mop out, then they can take a break from timeout, but then timeout starts with the full amount of time that they would have when they come out of the bathroom. And generally speaking, I don't recommend giving bathroom breaks. That when timeout starts, timeout's not done until it's over. Because the thing that you want to make sure, just like with the screeching and the police coming, you want to avoid, oh, I can get out of timeout by wetting my pants. And so if you want to be really, really diehard about this, then you can wet your pants all you want. And timeout's still going to last for 3 minutes. Yes?
I have a 21-year-old daughter, and when I put her in the corner, she cries and screams, and then she falls and bangs her head, and she'll bite herself. I mean, she just doesn't. And then she runs out of it and wants hugs and love, and I don't want to put her there because I'm afraid she's going to get hurt. You know, hurt herself, I mean, because she like, hit her head, or she'll fall back and hit her head on the corner of the wall or whatever. So I just don't know how to prevent her from doing that while she's in timeout.
This is a really important point, and one of the only times that you want to physically get involved if you see these particular kinds of problems in timeout. So if the child's doing anything dangerous or destructive, really destructive in timeout, like if they're leaving shoe marks on the wall, you can spot paint. But especially if you use the same corner, because that can be the timeout corner that eventually you paint over. In this situation, if you're seeing they're banging their head, they're biting themselves, those kinds of things, you can kind of hold on to their hands, and so they're not able to bite. And you can kind of sit down, you can either kind of hold them in a chair if you like, so they're not going to fall out of it, or you can hold on to their arms so they're not able to get them up there to bite. You don't want to put yourself in any kind of position where they can hurt you, but you also want to make sure that they're not in a position where they can hurt themselves. Yes?
I have a 3-year-old who, you know, if he's told he has to go in timeout, just becomes the blob and falls to the ground. And he's really large. Do you recommend carrying them or just waiting that one out, or how would you deal with that?
You can do it either way. That the timeout can happen wherever the blob lands, or you can escort them to timeout. I'd probably lean towards the escorting them to timeout because we want to kind of train this behavior, that this is where timeout happens, and these are the expectations, this is how you get into timeout, and this is the fastest way out of timeout.
Okay, so you wouldn't recommend waiting him out to when he's done blobbing and freaking out and then he walks? You'd recommend picking him up and getting him in there right away?
I can see why you would want to wait him out. I would be nervous about that because in some ways that reinforces the behavior, because he gets control over when the intervention happens. And he can kind of create this delay. And I'd be worried that if you wait him out, what he learns is the longer I carry on, the longer I can hold off going to timeout. Of course, he still gets the timeout at the end, but in the moment, I can buy myself 5, 10, 20, 30 minutes. Then you've got the timeout so far removed from the actual behavior that, you know, why am I even going to timeout anymore? So I would recommend escorting him into timeout. Sure. Yes.
For a child that hits like the wall, kicking and all that, can we put him in an area where there's nothing around them, and that will be the same?
Yes. The question was putting him in an area with nothing around him. That sounds ideal. And as far away from the TV and siblings and anything that they might enjoy as possible. You don't want to put I should clarify, I don't recommend closets. I don't recommend unfinished basements. We don't want this to be a traumatic experience or a terrifying experience. The power, again, it comes from the disconnection, the lack of attention from the caregiver. Yes.
I have 3 questions, but I won't ask all 3 at the same time. The first question is, what do you recommend for a parent if, you know, they get stuck in a situation where you try really, you know, really hard not to scream at them for the behaviors, to, you know, if they don't do something, kind of like you telling them to go to timeout, but then trying to do it in a calm manner, or, you know, when the the behavior is just really overwhelming for a parent to not scream, like scream, go to timeout, rather, just telling them that it's time for timeout.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any recommendations for?
This is a really good point. The question was what to do if you're really agitated or really upset or really hurt or scared when the child does whatever the child does to earn the timeout. And keeping with the idea that you want this to be as absolutely boring as possible, getting mom to yell is not boring. And so that's the part that's incompatible with this intervention. And walking them to timeout, taking them to timeout is much more effective than kind of raising your voice to achieve compliance. And also, the kind of screaming because you're upset is much more typically about the parent than about the child, if that makes sense. Yes?
What do you recommend for people who have other members of the family who don't necessarily do anything when, say, the child slaps them in the face? Because my kid hits me, I do something about it. She hits grandma, grandma doesn't think that's so bad. She thinks it's cute, she thinks it's funny. What do you do? And grandma's around a lot. Mm-hmm. And grandma thinks she knows better than me. So what do I do?
This gets back to a little bit of what I talked about in terms of having a plan in place. Having a conversation and consistency across caregivers. And it's a difficult situation. Are we talking about mother or mother-in-law? Oh, my mother. Okay. I wanted to see how many layers of complication we had. Okay. If she's not going to do something about it, then you need to do something about it. But the most effective way to correct the behavior is the person who is kind of in the thick of it is the one who does it. And so even if grandma doesn't think it's a problem and you think it's a problem, your grandma's has the ability or choice to say, I'm not going to discipline this because I don't view it as a problem. You, on the other hand, say you can't hit anybody, whether it's grandma or teacher or dad. You're going to timeout.
I have another diaper thing, rhyming. Sorry.
Yes.
So, kind of off of her 21, he just turned 2 last week. How do I get started? Just holding him, because he just screams and he runs, we put him somewhere and he's off and running and, because he's 2 and he doesn't quite get, what I'm doing. He just thinks I'm moving him from the situation. So I'm just holding him there for however long. I mean, is that the...
Typically, I say to start with taking him back a couple of times, and if the taking back a couple of times doesn't work, as long as you can do that, taking back a couple of times in a really boring way, then some kids will get the message that I'm not going anywhere. Some kids won't. And,
mine won't for a very long time.
And so if you have to sit there behind him, at 2 years old, you might be sitting on the floor, kind of holding his shoulders, but that's fine too. Yes, as long as there's not a word that comes out of your mouth, and if he's facing away from you, he won't see your face, just so there's no responsiveness from you whatsoever. Yes?
I'm trying to keep the kid from destroying my PlayStation 3 because he's taking the DVD in and out of there. So if I'm going to send him to timeout for that, when he's done with timeout, should I turn the movie back on, or because I don't think I should do 2 punishments, meaning turning the movie off because you keep taking the DVD out and then sending you to timeout, and then when you come out of timeout, the movie doesn't go back on.
Sort of double jeopardy.
So is that, yeah. So
how old?
He's going to be 3 in November.
Okay.
And he really understands that he shouldn't, but he does.
He really understands that he shouldn't be pulling
He really understands that he shouldn't, but he does, and I say he understands that he shouldn't because when he does it, and I realize that he's done it, he's trying to explain to me why he did it.
Okay.
So I think that if he's trying to explain to me why he did it, he understands that he shouldn't do it when he's been told.
This is another really good point. So the question was, what my child keeps pushing the eject button on the PlayStation to get the movie out. What do? I might expand that a little bit to talk about double jeopardy, that you don't want to have multiple consequences for the same crime or offense or problem behavior. So if they're playing, they're pulling the movie out, they go to timeout, they come out of timeout, they're back to the movie. And every single time they go for that eject button, they're in timeout.
I had been taking the movie, and then I just completely took the movies that he do that with, because he's trying to start it over. And I just put them back in the case and put them up, but I really don't want to take the movies away. So
restricting access doesn't seem like a bad idea. I mean, if they're a consistent problem, then it sounds like maybe what you want to do is give a smaller amount of time with them where you're monitoring closely, and so we can build up a little bit more trust.
Well, and I did that, but it didn't work. So I just took it out for about 2.5 weeks now. It's been completely out of sight. Not out of mind, but out of sight.
Well, it sounds like you're on the right track.
So.
Yes?
Am I right when I understand? So any negative behavior during timeout starts over. Like spitting, throwing shoes, hitting walls.
Everything you just anything that would get a consequence in and of itself starts the clock over. And so
it's not like a timeout to go vent and get your aggression out. That's not okay.
It can be, but it just means timeout hasn't started. That some kids need to sit and yell and scream for a couple of minutes. And so their timeout is 8 minutes long instead of 3 minutes long. And so they can decide, I'm going to settle myself down internally. I don't have to be kicking and screaming and hitting the walls and spitting and all these kinds of things, because I'd much rather be out of timeout in 3 minutes rather than 8 minutes. Yes?
Is there a different term to use rather than using the word timeout? I don't know.
Sure.
I mean, do you have any recommendation?
Whatever you want to use that conveys that you're starting this disciplinary approach. I've heard schools will use things like think time or stop time or the think chair, kind of calm down time. I think that the kind of what we've talked about in terms of procedure is more important, but I think that you're right. The question was calling it something else. And I think that you can call it something else because for some kids, timeout has a really powerful association. And so you can call it, think time or something like that. Yes?
They talked about being a statue and not making any responses to there, but if they're going crazy and they haven't stopped yet, you obviously, I'm assuming you tell them that timeout hasn't started. Or do you wait?
This is why you want to set it up very, very clearly at the front end. So the question was, what if they're freaking out and going crazy, and do you tell them the timeout hasn't started? No. That you want to tell them on the front end, this is how we're doing timeout from now on. If you're doing any of these things that you've done in the past, timeout's not going to have started. And so you can go into timeout and yell and kick and scream and go crazy and do all these other things, and the clock's not going to start. You don't want to give these reminders in timeout, because what that can show them is, this is how I get Dad involved. That I start freaking out in this kind of way, he'll come and remind me of these things. And then sometimes when parents go and give reminders, then the child will dispute those reminders, and then you get into this whole big thing, and it's not timeout anymore, right? Yes?
You can't punish them for everything at 2 and 3. So do you just pick the worst behaviors and do timeouts for those, and then some of the smaller things that are not? And when I say smaller things, the kid might be kicking a stick constantly with his shoe, and you're telling him, you don't want to do that, you could hurt your toe or tear up your shoes. Something like that, maybe not a timeout for, but then other things that are more important, like hitting or, throwing, things like that. So do you pick the more serious things and do timeouts for, and kind of ignore the other things until they become, or unless they would become more aggressive? Or
the question was choosing your battles. That you don't want to, do you want to give timeout for everything? And the answer is no, that you want to pick some prime targets of timeout. And also one of the things that's kind of a trend in these behaviors that we're talking about, especially for young kids, are you can't change the environment in such a way that they could still do these things. So the example was if he's kicking a stick, having him, telling him repeatedly to stop kicking the stick, you can just take the stick away. But in some of these other things that we're talking about, you can't take away the bookshelf that he's climbing up, or you can't take away the sister that he's hitting. And so they've engaged in that behavior, and then you give them a consequence for it.
Several times you've mentioned about, setting this up at the front end when, other questions have come up. So would you, in letting him know that, okay, if you are spitting, kicking, hitting, throwing things, should you maybe sit down, and tell him, these are the things that you will go to timeout for. He may not remember all 4 or 5, but he'll know that 3 of these things that he does a lot, he would end up going to timeout for. Would you let him know in advance before he?
Absolutely. You want
conversation during that time.
You want to set it up as explicitly as possible beforehand. Yes. I'm sorry, did you have?
When a child misbehaves and then you are taking him to timeout, then he hits you, and then do you combine timeouts for 2 misbehaviors, or do you give separate?
I would not. Whatever transgression got him into timeout, you're giving a consequence for that event. And what they're learning is if they go calmly and quietly to timeout, it's over faster. And that if they hit you, it's not going to get you any more upset. It's not going to get you any more attention. But I can hit, kick, scream, bite, do whatever on the way to timeout, and it's not going to have any effect on my experience of this consequence. And so I wouldn't recommend doubling up if there are kind of problem behaviors on the way to timeout. Yes?
My son lately has just started, I'll say, he's standing up on the chair, please sit down. He'll be like, time out! But we'll say it, and I'm like, no, I just want you to sit down. You don't have to go to timeout. What do you? You're like, time out on everything. And I swear I'm not using it that often.
So the question was kind of self-imposed timeouts?
Well, he just kind of yells timeout, but he doesn't go and take a timeout. I don't know what he's doing. He thinks I'm gonna punish him for everything. And I swear I'm pretty nice. Maybe even too nice sometimes.
It sounds like that's pretty attention driven, that he's excited about your response to timeout. How old?
2.5.
One of the other things that comes online in this developmental period is getting really, really, really excited about predictability. And so that's why kids want to read the same book 100,000 times, because they know what's on the next page. And so they're just kind of getting a sense of themselves in the world, and when this happens, this next thing happens. And so if they can generate a predictable response out of their parents, they get kind of excited about it. And so if he has kind of a timeout call out and it gets something out of you that, yeah, I would handle it very kind of nonchalantly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If
Yes.
it's timeout and you have to start the timeout over, do you say, your time starts over, or do you just set the time, redo it, say nothing?
You just redo it.
Okay.
When they're in timeout, you don't want to say a word. You're totally off thinking about a statue. Yes?
On the double jeopardy issue, if say you're putting him in timeout because he won't pick up a bucket of toys, do you then put him in timeout and then make him pick up the bucket of toys after?
When they come out of timeout, you go back to what got them in timeout in the first place. So obviously it doesn't apply in hitting situations, but in compliance situations, pick up your toys, pick up your toys. You're not following directions, you're in timeout. Timeout transpires, comes out of timeout. You were in timeout for not picking up your toys. Please put the Legos in the bucket. No, I'm not going to do that. Please put the Legos in the bucket. Doesn't happen, back into timeout. So the only way that this sequence ends is you doing what I've told you to do.
Is it as effective for a 2-year-old when they go to timeout, and even though they can't really talk too much, but they say the sign for I'm sorry to get him out? I've noticed that at least my 2-year-old realizes that, hurry, I say I'm sorry and make the face, I'm good. Or do I try to, okay, thank you for saying sorry, but you stay?
The question was, if the child apologizes, do they get to come out of timeout? There's something really, really fundamental that you're teaching your children with consequences, and that your action has consequences. And this might be helpful, maybe it's too extreme. If you're going to the Nebraska game down I-80 at 90 miles an hour, and you tell the sheriff that pulls you over, I'm really sorry. Do you get out of the ticket? You don't get out of the ticket, most of the time. Very similar in these situations. If, even that young, it's wonderful that they're already saying they're sorry, and at that young, the function of that behavior is to escape the consequence they're experiencing. And so, wonderful that they're sorry. You want to be excited about that in the future when accidents happen and they're apologetic about the accidents that happen. If they're only saying they're sorry when they're in timeout, that's a really good indicator that this is about getting out of timeout rather than a very deep-seated remorse for my transgression. Yes?
Okay, when you were talking about the compliance issues and for timeout, but then, so you know, pick up your toys, pick up your toys. How many times do you say that before you get timeout?
Depends on the age of the child.
Let's go 2.5.
Twice.
Okay. And I mean, I understand like hitting.
And there are intermediate steps between doing timeout and just sort of giving the command and doing timeout. There are lots of different strategies you can use in terms of sort of helping or guiding to the task, and then if you get resistance in the guidance, like there are some steps in between at that age. If we were talking about a 5-year-old and you say pick up your toys and you get a no, then it's time for a timeout. Yes?
But up to what age? I mean, back to her question, you said 2 times, he's 2.5 years old. But how do you, from 2.5, and I know you said 5, if he said no, it's okay, then you go to timeout. But it's like, how many times, you don't, or do you, maybe my question should be, do you use the age factor, like for the number of minutes, like, okay, you're 3 years old, if you do a good timeout, you're going to be in there 3 minutes if you don't hassle, you know. Are you going to ask them 3 times to pick up their toys? You know, giving them 3 chances to pick them up before you say, okay, we're going to go to timeout, you're going to go to timeout?
The reason I use 2 as a general rule is because after asking more than 2 times, you're fighting a losing battle, and your kind of compliance rate drops below 50%. And that's a really rigid clinical expectation. And that's kind of where I'm coming from, because our goal is the first time. And so you ask once and they do it the first time, it's 100%. You ask once, they don't do it. You ask the second time and they do it after the second time, you've got 1 instance of compliance out of 2. You got to go to a third time, you've dropped below 50%. And ultimately, with the goal being first time every time, which is not a realistic expectation for any kid at any age, but trying to get as close as possible to, I told you once and you did it, then I don't typically recommend telling more than twice.
My 3 are just, he doesn't say no. He just flat out ignores me and goes about his business. Like he can't hear me. And I know that's not the case.
This is a great question too. So getting ignored when you're giving commands. There are lots of different ways to handle that. So timeout is a great way to get their attention. And so if you tell them once and you tell them twice, you're not following directions, now you have timeout. Especially at 3, then you can use timeout for non-compliance, definitely. Yes?
Is timeout the best solution for if they do bite you or anybody else? Is that the best way to get them to stop biting?
That is, the question was about biting. That's generally what I recommend. And as soon as the bite happens, they're immediately into timeout.
I mean, I've been doing that for a while, and then she still is biting. You know, and then she bites herself. You know, so you tell her stuff like, "You bit me," and then she'll bite herself, and then.
Is she always in your care?
No. I mean, most of the time, but I mean, my mom and dad watch her.
When she's not in your care, you've got to make sure that as close to 100% of the time when a bite happens, the timeout happens immediately, and you want to make sure it's really boring. Because timeout can function to do all kinds of things. Get me out of something I don't want to do, get me a whole lot of attention, or get me the toy that somebody else is holding. It can never get what it's supposed to achieve. That it always gets a timeout. And if kids can get away with it even occasionally to get what they want, then it's going to keep going. All right, well, thank you very much for coming tonight. Here's my contact information if you have more questions, and I think there might be an email address in some of these forms somewhere. So if you've got more questions that you didn't get asked or I missed any on the list, let me know and I can answer them. All right? Thank you for coming out tonight. Yeah, absolutely.